Welcome again to another video highlighting stupid things I believed as a child. Let's get started. It cannot be stressed enough how much of an impact cartoons had on my childhood. I lived for them. Until Star Wars came out, my life revolved around Saturday mornings. Upon awakening each day, rather than saying good morning to the first adult I'd see, instead I would ask, "Is it cartoon day?" Only to be disappointed 85% of the time. Focusing on anything that much does tend to skew your perception of the world, so much so, if there was so much as a single Bugs Bunny appearance on television, it was Saturday. Despite this love of cartoons, I do have a shameful secret to admit. Scooby-Doo scared the hell out of me. Can you blame me? Look at that opening. Those bats flapping over a haunted house. That creepy text. All those monsters. This was a horror show. When Scooby-Doo came on the screen, I either ran from the room or cried for an adult to come and change the channel. Scary shows involving talking dogs and hippies aside, imagine my outrage being dragged to church one Sunday after noticing a cartoon playing on a local syndicated television station. My stupid grandma wouldn't believe me when I desperately tried to explain to her that it couldn't possibly be Sunday because look, right there on the TV, Pink Panther. Pink Panther! Is it any wonder I became an atheist not long after? Speaking of church, the one they forced me to had a bathroom that confused me. It was an older building, but still had separate facilities for men and women. I had no idea what the ladies' room looked like, but the men's had several weird things mounted to walls with funny soap at the bottom, in addition to the normal-looking toilets. Each of these unidentified objects had yellowing hand-printed note cards that said, "No butts, please," punctuated with a frowny face. I kinda figured, yeah, you probably shouldn't poop in the big long things because I couldn't see how turds would go down since there wasn't a big enough hole at the bottom. But it also made me afraid to poop in the toilets because maybe God didn't want poop at his church at all because he didn't like the smell. It wasn't until years later that I discovered the part of a cigarette that didn't burn was called a butt, or appreciate the fact that janitorial staff probably didn't enjoy having to pick them out of the bottom of a urinal. Ketchup wasn't something I ate regularly growing up. My mom would add some to the bologna sandwiches she served me, but I never really noticed since mayonnaise was also usually added as well. Even eating at McDonald's or Burger Chef didn't involve much ketchup because I always ignored the gross hamburgers in my fun meals, and as most fast food French fries were eaten in the car, my mother didn't give me condiments for obvious reasons. Occasionally, Mom would make incredible homemade French fries, but because they were so different from what most fast food restaurants served, I never made the connection that they were essentially the same food item. When Mom gave me a plate of her homemade fries, she always included a small puddle of ketchup on the side. Apart from the flavor and size, the biggest difference between homemade fries and what you got at McDonald's was the latter had been sitting under a heat lamp for a while to remain lukewarm, while the former was blistering hot straight out of the fryer. So I inferred the ketchup was simply something scientists invented to help cool down French fries so you could eat them. Am I the only one who sort of misses Burger Chef? Much of my early childhood was spent at my grandparents' house. While Grandpa worked outside the home, Grandma ran a small catering business from an upstairs shop attached to their split-level colonial home, and the kitchen was always filled with confectionery. To be honest, with the exception of her caramel, God help you if you pronounced it caramel, which still remains possibly the single greatest candy imaginable, most of what she made was chalky and not nearly as appealing as what you'd find near the registers at the grocery store. The flavor wasn't the point, of course, as she usually catered weddings where the only thing that mattered was how nice everything looked, and to that end, she was extremely talented. While tasting bland, her cakes were works of art that any wedding party would be proud to have at the center of their reception, and her individual sugar flowers and other table decorations were impressive as hell. The key word here is sugar. And to most kids, even if not as tasty as a Hershey candy bar, if something contains sugar, it's worth eating. And despite my terror at provoking her, I was forever sneaking up to Grandma's kitchen and stealing little bits of her work as she toiled away for whatever wedding was scheduled that weekend. Sometimes she'd catch me, and if I wasn't quick enough, I got swatted. Usually pretty hard. Once, my sugar thievery must have really screwed something up because she slapped my 4-year-old arm with enough force to leave a huge handprint. Sobbing, I ran downstairs to sulk, and noticing how bright red my arm was, I knew it had to be tended to. My preschool brain understood that first aid was a thing, but it wasn't quite sophisticated enough to know if and how it should be applied, nor did my knowledge of human anatomy understand that unless it turned blue, black, or blistered, bright red marks would eventually fade away in a relatively short amount of time. Also, the only first aid I knew was Johnson & Johnson Band-Aids, so I proceeded to apply bandages to every spot on my arm with even a little bit of red, eventually leaving the entire thing looking like a cheap mummy cosplay. It's probably best I don't recall Grandma's reaction to finding an empty box of expensive Band-Aids. At the risk of getting political, children should not be indoctrinated into anything if they're too young to understand what it is they're getting into. After all, there's a reason why contracts aren't legally binding if the signer is under 18. Yet every day in the United States, kids just barely old enough to successfully hold their bladders are being administered a loyalty oath without fully understanding anything about it. The Pledge of Allegiance has been a mainstay of American life for over 100 years, originally starting out as a quick secular oath of loyalty before getting usurped in 1954 by Christians determined to foist their religion on the rest of us with the blatantly unconstitutional addition of the words "under God." Subsequent lawsuits over the years by atheists determined to preserve the Constitution have unfortunately not yet been successful, as the courts continue to ignore this obvious violation of the First Amendment because judges are often just as biased as the politicians who appointed them. A compelling argument could also be made that the pledge itself is problematic because one is delivering an oath of loyalty to the flag and not to the Constitution, which puts the emphasis on jingoistic symbols rather than the law and heart of the United States itself. Politics and religion aside, a more concerning question is whether or not it's smart, or even ethical, to force school children to pledge fealty to a country or symbols they know little about. After all, a 6-year-old's vocabulary is generally well under 3,000 total words.
Remember, there's this brilliant one where Dick buys this ball, this big red ball. It's amazing stuff.
While words like big, red, and ball can be expected to be known and understood by the average kindergartner, other concepts like republic or liberty might be a bit too taxing. In fact, if you walked into the average elementary school, provided you can get around the armed guards and security glass, and interviewed random students, it's unlikely many of them could define even the words pledge or allegiance. Even fewer would be able to adequately explain what the United States actually is or how its government functions. Yet each and every day, most are compelled to stand at attention and recite words of little to no meaning to them in a rote display of patriotism intended to instill thoughtless loyalty and religion in the impressionable minds of our most vulnerable citizens. While school curricula may have changed since I was an elementary student, at no point before 6th grade did any of my teachers ever take the time to actually explain the purpose of the pledge or define any of the concepts within. Being of slightly higher curiosity than many my age, 6-year-old me did make an effort to understand the words the teachers forced the class to recite daily. While Republic was beyond me, indivisible obviously meant something that couldn't be seen by the naked eye, while Witches stands brought to mind the image of green-skinned crones standing on podiums casting spells. Under God was the easiest part, as Grandma had been dragging me to church every Sunday my entire life, so I knew all about the giant bearded man living in the sky. Thus, for the first several years of my school life, I was essentially declaring my loyalty to invisible sorceresses casting black magic while God helplessly watched from above. Good job, Christians.